Ali Baba and the 40 Thieves, from the Arabian Nights, or the 1001 Tales of Scheherazade. Translated by Edward William Lane. The desperate entertainment of a wife delaying execution by her husband, this translation of 42 stories from a much larger collection has become the most well-known of folk tales for younger readers. It includes Aladdin and his wonderful lamp, The Voyages of Sinbad, and Ali Baba and the 40 Thieves. In former days there lived in a town of Persia 2 brothers, one named Qasim and the other Ali Baba. Their father divided a small inheritance equally between them. Qasim married a rich wife and became a wealthy merchant. Ali Baba married a woman as poor as himself and lived by cutting wood and bringing it upon 3 asses into the town to sell. One day, when Ali Baba was in the forest and had just cut wood enough to load his asses, he saw at a distance a great cloud of dust approaching him. He observed it with attention, and distinguished soon after a body of horsemen, whom he suspected to be robbers. He determined to leave his asses in order to save himself, so he climbed up a large tree, planted on a high rock, the branches of which were thick enough to conceal him, and yet enabled him to see all that passed without being discovered. The troop, to the number of 40, well mounted and armed, came to the foot of the rock on which the tree stood, and there dismounted. Every man unbridled his horse, tied him to some shrub, and hung about his neck a bag of corn which they carried behind them. Then each took off his saddlebag, which from its weight seemed to Ali Baba to be full of gold and silver. One, whom he took to be their captain, came under the tree in which he was concealed, and making his way through some shrubs, pronounced the words, "Open! Sim Sim!" A door opened in the rock, and after he had made all his troop enter before him, he followed them, when the door shut again of itself. The robbers stayed some time within the rock, during which Ali Baba, fearful of being caught, remained in the tree. At last the door opened again, and as the captain went in last, so he came out first, and stood to see them all pass him by, when Ali Baba heard him make the door close by pronouncing the words, "Shut! Sim Sim!" Every man at once went and bridled his horse, fastened his wallet, and mounted again. And when the captain saw them all ready, he put himself at their head and returned the way they had come. Ali Baba followed them with his eyes as far as he could see them, and afterward waited a long time before he descended. Remembering the words the captain of the robbers used to cause the door to open and shut, he wished to try if his pronouncing them would have the same effect. Accordingly, he went among the shrubs, and, receiving the door concealed behind them, stood before it, and said, "Open, Sim Sim," whereupon the door instantly flew wide open. Now Ali Baba expected a dark, dismal cavern, but was surprised to see a well-lighted and spacious chamber, lighted from an opening at the top of the rock, and filled with all sorts of provisions, rich bales of silk, embroideries, and valuable tissues piled upon one another, gold and silver ingots in great heaps, and money in bags. The sight of all these riches made him suppose that this cave must have been occupied for ages by robbers who had succeeded one another. Ali Baba went boldly into the cave, and collected as much of the gold coin, which was in bags, as his 3 asses could carry. When he had loaded them with the bags, he laid wood over them so that they could not be seen. Then he stood before the door, and pronouncing the words, "Shut! Sim Sim!" the door closed of itself, and he made the best of his way to town. When he got home, he drove his asses into a little yard, shut the gates carefully, threw off the wood that covered the panniers, carried the bags into his house, and ranged them in order before his wife. He then emptied the bags, which raised such a heap of gold as dazzled his wife's eyes. And then he told her the whole adventure from beginning to end, and above all recommended her to keep it a secret. The wife rejoiced greatly at their good fortune, and would count all the gold piece by piece. "Wifey," replied Ali Baba, "you do not know what you undertake. When you pretend to count the money, you will never have done. I will dig a hole and bury it. There is no time to be lost." "You are in the right, husband," she replied. "But let us know, as nigh as possible, how much we have. I will borrow a small measure, and measure it while you dig the hole." So the wife ran to her brother-in-law Kasim, who lived hard by, and addressing herself to his wife, desired her to lend her a measure for a little while. The sister-in-law did so, but as she knew Ali Baba's poverty, she was curious to know what sort of grain his wife wanted to measure, and artfully put some suet at the bottom of the measure. Ali Baba's wife went home, set the measure upon the heap of gold, filled it, and emptied it often upon the divan, till she had done, when she was very well satisfied to find the number of measures amounted to so many as they did, and went to tell her husband, who had almost finished digging the hole. While Ali Baba was burying the gold, his wife carried the measure back again to her sister-in-law, but without taking notice that a piece of gold had stuck to the bottom.
"Sister,"
said she, giving it to her again,
"you see that I have not kept your measure very long. I am obliged to you for it, and return it with thanks."
As soon as she was gone, Kasim's wife looked at the bottom of the measure, and was amazed to find a piece of gold sticking to it. Envy immediately possessed her breast.
"What?"
she said.
"Has Ali Baba gold so plentiful as to measure it? Whence has he all this wealth?"
Kasim, her husband, was at his shop. When he came home, his wife said to him,
"Kasim, I know you think yourself rich, but Ali Baba is infinitely richer than you. He does not count his money, he measures it."
Then she told him the stratagem she had used to make the discovery, and showed him the piece of money, which was so old that they could not tell in what prince's reign it was coined. Now Kasim, after he had married the rich widow, had never treated Ali Baba as a brother, but neglected him, and now, instead of being pleased, he conceived a base envy at his brother's prosperity. He could not sleep all that night, and went to him in the morning before sunrise. "Ali Baba," said he, "I am surprised at you. You pretend to be miserably poor, and yet you measure gold. My wife found this at the bottom of the measure you borrowed yesterday." By this discourse, Ali Baba perceived that Kasim and his wife, through his own wife's folly, knew what they had so much reason to conceal. But what was done could not be undone. Therefore, without showing the least surprise or trouble, he confessed all, and offered his brother part of his treasure to keep the secret. Kasim rose next morning long before the sun, and set out for the forest with 10 mules bearing great chests, which he intended to fill, and followed the road which Ali Baba had indicated. He was not long before he reached the rock, and found the place, by the tree and other marks which his brother had given him. When he reached the entrance of the cavern, he pronounced the words, "Open, Sim Sim." The door immediately opened, and when he was in, closed upon him. He was rejoiced to find much more riches than he expected. He quickly laid as many bags of gold as he could carry at the door of the cavern, but his thoughts were so full of the great riches he should possess that he could not think of the word to make it open, but instead of "Sim Sim," he said, "Open, barley," and was much amazed to find that the door remained fast shut. He named several sorts of grain, but still the door would not open, and the more he endeavored to remember the word "Sim Sim," the more his memory was confused, and he had as much forgotten it as if he had never heard it mentioned. He threw down the bags he had loaded himself with, and walked distractedly up and down the cave, without having any regard to the riches around him. About noon the robbers visited their cave. At some distance they saw Kasim's mules straggling around the rock with great chests on their backs. Alarmed at this, they galloped full speed to the cave. They drove away the mules, who strayed through the forest so far that they were soon out of sight, and then, with naked sabres in their hands, they approached the door, which, on their captain pronouncing the proper words, immediately opened. Kasim, who heard the noise of the horses' feet, at once guessed the arrival of the robbers, and resolved to make one effort for his life. He rushed to the door, and no sooner saw the door open than he ran out and threw the leader down. But he could not escape the other robbers, who, with their scimitars, soon deprived him of life. The first care of the robbers after this was to examine the cave. They found all the bags which Kasim had brought to the door to be ready to load his mules, and carried them back to their places, but they did not miss what Ali Baba had taken away before. Then, holding a council and deliberating upon this occurrence, they guessed that Kasim, why he was in, could not get out again, but could not imagine how he had learned the secret words by which he alone could enter. So, to terrify any person who should attempt the same thing, they cut Qasim's body into 4 quarters and hung 2 on one side and 2 on the other within the door of the cave. Then they mounted their horses and went to beat the roads again and to attack the caravans they might meet. In the meantime, Qasim's wife was very uneasy when night came and her husband was not returned. She ran to Ali Baba in great alarm and said,
"I believe, brother-in-law, that you know Qasim is gone to the forest, and upon one account. It is now night, and he has not returned. I am afraid some misfortune has happened to him."
So after midnight, Ali Baba departed with his 3 asses and went to the forest. And when he came near the rock, having seen neither his brother nor the mules on his way, was alarmed at finding some blood spilt near the door, which he took for an ill omen. But when he had pronounced the word, and the door had opened, he was struck with horror at the dismal sight of his brother's body. He went into the cave, however, to find something to enshroud the remains, and having loaded one of his asses with them, covered them over with wood. The other 2 asses he loaded with bags of gold, covering them with wood also as before, and then bidding the door shut, came away. When he came home, he drove the 2 asses loaded with gold into his yard, and left the care of unloading them to his wife, while he led the other to his sister-in-law's house. There he knocked on the door, which was opened by Marjana, a clever slave girl who was fruitful in inventions to meet the most difficult circumstances. When he came into the court, he unloaded the ass, and taking Marjana aside, said to her,
"You must observe an inviolable secrecy. Your master's body is contained in these 2 panniers. We must bury him as if he had died a natural death. Go now, and tell your mistress. I leave the matter to your wit and skilful devices."
Marjana went out early the next morning to a druggist and asked for a sort of lozenge which was considered efficacious in the most dangerous disorders. The apothecary inquired who was ill. She replied with a sigh,
"Our good master Qasim himself, and that he could not neither eat nor speak."
In the evening Marjana went to the same druggist's again, and with tears in her eyes asked for an essence, which they used to give to sick people only when at the last extremity.
"Alas," she
said, taking it from the apothecary,
"I am afraid that this remedy will have no better effect than the lozenges, and that I shall lose my good master."
All that day Ali Baba and his wife were seen going between Qasim's and their own house, and nobody was surprised in the evening to hear the lamentable shrieks and cries of Qasim's wife and Marjana, who gave out everywhere that her master was dead. The next morning at daybreak, Marjana went to an old cobbler whom she knew to be always early at his stall, and bidding him good morrow, put a piece of gold into his hand, saying,
"Baba Mustafa, you must bring with you your sewing tackle, and come with me, but I must tell you, I shall blindfold you when you come to such a place."
Baba Mustafa seemed to hesitate a little at these words.
Oh, replied he, "you would have me do something against my conscience or against my honor." "God forbid," said Marjana,
putting another piece of gold into his hand,
"that I would ask anything that is contrary to your honor. Only come along with me, and fear nothing."
Baba Mustafa went with Marjana, who, after she had bound his eyes with a handkerchief at the place she had mentioned, conveyed him to her deceased master's house, and never uncovered his eyes till he had entered the room where she had put the corpse together.
"Baba Mustafa," said she, "you must make haste, and sew the parts of this body together, and when you have done, I will give you another piece of gold."
After Baba Mustafa had finished his task, she blindfolded him again, and gave him the 3rd piece of gold as she had promised, and recommending secrecy to him, carried him back to the place where she had first bound his eyes, pulled off the bandage, and let him go home, but watched him that he returned towards his stall till he was quite out of sight, for fear he should have the curiosity to return and follow her. She went home, and on her return warmed some water to wash the body, and at the same time Ali Baba perfumed it with incense and wrapped it in the grave clothes with the accustomed ceremonies. Not long after, they brought the bier, and the imam and the other ministers of the mosque arrived. 4 neighbors carried the corpse to the burying ground, following the imam who recited the prayers. Ali Baba came after, and Marjana followed the procession weeping, beating her breast and tearing her hair. Qasim's wife stayed at home mourning, uttering lamentable cries with the women of the neighborhood, who came, according to custom, during the funeral, and joining their lamentations with hers, filled the quarter far and near with sounds of grief. 3 or 4 days after the funeral, Ali Baba removed his few goods openly to his sister-in-law's house, in which he would in future live, but the money he had taken from the robbers he conveyed thither by night. As for Qasim's shop, he entrusted it entirely to the management of his eldest son. While these things were being done, the 40 robbers again visited their retreat in the forest. Great, then, was their surprise to find Qasim's body taken away, with some of their bags of gold.
"We are certainly discovered," said the captain. "The removal of the body and the loss of some of the money plainly shows that the man whom we had killed had an accomplice, and for our own lives' sake we must try and find him. What say you, my sons?"
All the robbers unanimously approved of the captain's proposal.
"Well," said the captain, "one of you, the boldest and the most skillful among you, must go into the town, disguised as a traveler and a stranger, to try if he can hear any talk of the man whom we have killed, and endeavor to find out who he was and where he lived. This is a matter of the first importance, and for fear of any treachery, I propose that whoever undertakes this business without success, even though the failure arises only from an error of judgment, shall suffer death."
Without waiting for the sentiments of his companions, one of the robbers started up and said,
"I submit to this condition, and deem it an honor to expose my life to serve the troop."
He then disguised himself and went into the town just at daybreak, and walked up and down till accidentally he came to Baba Mustafa's stall, which was always open before any of the shops. Baba Mustafa was seated with an awl in his hand, just going to work. The robber gave him good morrow, and perceiving that he was old, said,
"Oh, uncle, you begin to work very early. Is it possible that one of your age can see so well? I question, even if it were somewhat lighter, whether you could see to stitch." "You do not know me," replied Baba Mustafa. "For old as I am, I have extraordinary good eyes, and you will not doubt it when I tell you that I sewed the body of a dead man together in a place where I had not so much light as I have now."
"A dead body!" exclaimed the robber, with affected amazement.
Yes, answered Baba Mustafa. "I see you want me to speak out, but you shall know no more."
The robber felt sure that he had discovered what he sought. He pulled out a piece of gold, and putting it into Baba Mustafa's hand, said to him,
"I do not want to learn your secret, though you might safely trust me with it. The only thing I desire of you is to show me the house where you stitched up the dead body." "If I were disposed to do you that favor," replied Baba Mustafa, "I could not. I was taken to a certain place, whence I was led blindfolded to the house, and afterwards brought back again in the same manner. It is therefore impossible for me to again do what you wish." "Perhaps," said the robber, "you may remember a little of the way that you were led blindfolded. Come, let me blind your eyes at the same place. We will walk together. Perhaps you may recognize some part, and as everybody are to be paid for their trouble, there is another piece of gold for you. Gratify me in what I ask you."
So saying, he put another piece of gold into his hand.
"I cannot promise," said Baba Mustafa, "that I can remember the way exactly, but since you wish it, I will try what I can do."
At these words he arose, to the great joy of the robber, and led him to the place where Marjana had bound his eyes.
"It was here," said Baba Mustafa. "I was blindfolded, and I turned this way."
The robber tied his handkerchief over his eyes, and walked by him till he stopped at Qasim's house, where Ali Baba then lived. The thief, before he pulled off the band, marked the door with a piece of chalk which he had ready in his hand, and then asked him if he knew whose house that was, to which Baba Mustafa replied that as he did not live in that neighborhood, he could not tell. The robber thanked him for the trouble he had taken, and left him to go back to his stall, while he returned to the forest. A little after the robber and Baba Mustafa had parted, Marjana went out of Ali Baba's house upon an errand, and upon her return, seeing the mark the robber had made, stopped to observe it.
"What can be the meaning of this mark?"
she said to herself.
Somebody intends my master no good. However, with whatever intention it was done, it is advisable to guard against the worst.
Accordingly, she fetched a piece of chalk and marked 2 or 3 doors on each side, in the same manner, without saying a word to her master or mistress. In the meantime, the robber rejoined his troop in the forest and recounted to them his success, expatiating upon his good fortune in meeting so soon with the only person who could inform him of what he wanted to know. All the robbers listened to him with the utmost satisfaction, when the captain, after commending his diligence, addressing himself to them all, said, "Comrades, we have no time to lose. Let us set off well armed, without its appearing who we are. But that we may not excite any suspicion, let only 1 or 2 go into the town together, and join at the rendezvous, which shall be the great square. In the meantime, our comrades who brought us the good news and I will go and find out the house, that we may consult what had best be done." This was approved by all, and they filed off in parties of 2 each after some interval of time, and got into the town without being suspected. The captain and he who had visited the town in the morning as spy came in the last. He led the captain into the street where he had marked Ali Baba's residence, and when they came to the first of the houses which Marjana had marked, he pointed it out. But the captain observed that the next door was chalked in the same manner, and in the same place, and showing it to his guide, asked him what house it was, that or the first. The guide was so confounded that he knew not what answer to make, but still more puzzled when he and the captain saw 5 or 6 houses similarly marked. He assured the captain with an oath that he had marked that one, and could not tell who had chalked the rest, and so he could not distinguish the house which the cobbler had stopped at. The captain, finding that their design had proven abortive, went directly to the place of rendezvous, and told his followers that they had lost their labor and must return to the cave. So they all returned as they had come. When the troop was all got together, the captain told them the reason of their returning, and presently the conductor was declared by all worthy of death. But as the safety of the troop required the discovery of the second intruder into the cave, another of the gang, who promised himself that he should succeed better, came forward, and his offer being accepted, he went and corrupted Baba Mustafa, as the other had done, and being shown the house, marked it in a place more remote from sight with red chalk. Not long after, Marjana, whose eyes nothing could escape, went out, and seeing the red chalk, and arguing with herself as she had done before, marked the other neighbors' houses in the same place and manner. Accordingly, when the robber and his captain came to the street, they found the same difficulty, at which the captain was enraged, and the robber in as great confusion as his predecessor. Thus the captain and his troop were forced to retire a second time, and much more dissatisfied, while the robber, who had been the author of the mistake, underwent the same punishment. The captain, having lost 2 brave fellows of his troop, was afraid of diminishing it too much by pursuing this plan to get information of the residence of their plunderer, and therefore resolved to take upon himself the important commission. We'll conclude with Ali Baba and the 40 Thieves in Part 2. Good night, Nora.